Welcome to this next session of the UANI 2022 Summit. I'm really also very happy to welcome Senator Jim Langford of Oklahoma, who has become one of the Senate's leaders on our policy toward Iran. And I must say, to be as direct as I can, we at UANI really appreciate his leadership. He has led in introducing bipartisan legislation, a resolution opposing any removal of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps from the Foreign Terrorist Organization list. It got 62 votes, which is a lot of votes in the U.S. Senate these days, including 16 Democrats, most of whom voted for the JCPOA in 2015. And I don't think it was coincidental that after the vote on that resolution, President Biden announced that the administration would not take the IRGC off the foreign terrorist list. So it's just one indication of many of Jim Langford's leadership on this and other issues that matter to us. And I also must say, just personally, having spent a lot of my 24 years in the Senate working on policy toward Iran, it was always bipartisan until 2015, when it was broken by the partisan division over the JCPOA. I hope and pray that that bipartisanship can be restored. And the Lankford resolution I've just talked about was a long way toward doing that. We don't have a lot of time, so I just want to say, about Jim's biography. He worked for many years before getting into politics, and what is unusual training for it, but probably, in my opinion, the best training. He worked in the Baptist ministries in Oklahoma, serving families and students throughout the state. Ran for the Congress and was elected in 2010, served for 2 years, and then came into the Senate in 2014. He's on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Finance Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and in my time, the committee that most people didn't want to serve on, the Senate Ethics Committee. So, Jim, thank you for being here, and thank you for your leadership. Let me open with a general question, which is, why has our policy toward Iran been such a personal priority for you? And also, what do you think should happen now with the negotiations over the JCPOA 2.0 that are occurring in Vienna?
Well, Joe, thanks for being for allowing me to be in the conversation today. I really do appreciate it. Appreciate your leadership as well for so long, and the leadership of this organization is incredibly important. World stability, quite frankly. Iran is the destabilizer in that region, and we have multiple different countries and regimes that end up destabilizing many parts of the world. In that region, Iran is the destabilizer. It's not the Iranian people, it's the regime that they're living under. That is the issue and continues to be the issue for the entire area. So for me, if we're going to continue to have a peaceful existence in that region, we're going to have stability and deal with other threats that we have in other parts of the world, we have to have some sort of consistency there. So while I have a personal passion for Israel and a connection to that nation, as I know you're exceptionally connected as well, the whole region really bases around trying to be able to manage Iran's destabilizing efforts, whether it be Hamas, whether it be what's happening in Hezbollah, whether it be what they're doing in Syria right now, what they're doing to be able to basically smuggle oil all over the region. All those are based all around their destabilizing activities. So for me, it's a big issue to be able to say, just on the foreign policy level, we've got to make sure that we continue to keep sanctions on that regime and to be able to say to them, you're welcome to be able to join the peaceful groups of nations around the world, but you can't promote terrorism around the world. You can't destabilize the entire region and join the rest of the world economically as well.
That's great. I couldn't agree with you more, and I thank you for the strength and clarity of that statement. So give us your read on where the negotiations on the JCPOA in Vienna are now, and what you would like to see happen.
Well, we did see a big break, as you mentioned earlier. It was building towards trying to be able to get to an agreement. And then Iran brought its final statement there to say they want the IRGC to be able to come off the foreign terrorist organization list as one of their pieces. That was, in many ways, a last straw moment for me. I've been speaking out for this often. And so that's when I brought the resolution, was able to bring it to the floor in an amendment process to say, we cannot allow this base level thing. We should all be able to agree, all 100 of us, the IRGC cannot come off the foreign terrorist organization. And if we're going to negotiate with Iran, dealing with nuclear capabilities, we can't ignore their other terrorist activities as well, as if they're two different issues. They're not. They're developing missile technologies to carry a nuclear weapon. They're continuing to be able to expand their networks to carry out this kind of terrorism. So the push in our resolution was very clear to say these two things have to go together. You can't isolate them. That became a breaking point, quite frankly, for the administration, because when we had so many people at a bipartisan level agree with that simple statement, that changed the course of the negotiations. As you mentioned, it wasn't long after that, the Biden administration came out and said, okay, we're setting aside the IRGC. At that point, Iran came back and said, well, we want to create a whole new list of demands in as well. And as recently as just the last few hours, the administration has stepped out again and said, okay, things are getting more difficult in the negotiation rather than less. We all knew this was so. I don't blame the administration for being able to try, but you can't look away from the terrorist activities and what the IRGC is doing and just assume that nuclear ambitions are isolated. They're not isolated. It's all one big package. So it looks more and more likely that this agreement is not going to come together, which again reinforces back to the world again, what's the next step then? How do we actually keep sanctions? How do we deal with the oil, all those things as well? So there'll be a different level. It's not that we just walk away and ignore it. Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, but this just reinforces to everyone else in the world that's on a reasonable level for diplomacy that we have to have other means to be able to limit them.
I know. Okay, I know that you have talking about what happens next, assuming the JCPOA is not adopted again. I know you've introduced a piece of legislation called the Iran Sanctions Preservation Act. Could you describe a little bit of what that legislation would do and whether you think it's gaining support in the Senate?
I do think it's gaining support on this, and we're going to continue to be able to work in a bipartisan way. As you mentioned before, dealing with the issue of, quite frankly, Israel and Iran and isolating Iran, these were not partisan issues for a very long time. I'm trying to get back to those being nonpartisan issues, and I think we can, again, do that. So I'm going to continue to be able to work this way. The preserving the sanctions piece just continues to be able to preserve the oil sanctions, the technology sanctions, the financial transaction sanctions on Iran, to be able to say to the rest of the world agrees that Iran is the pariah state here at this point. We've got to be able to put some limitations around them. And Iran's very actively moving to be able to sell their oil in the world market right now. But the greatest gain that we have as a group of nations around the world is to be able to say, we're not going to do trade with them. We're not going to allow their finance to be able to travel across the nation. And they, most importantly, can't have oil sales across the rest of the world. That even if they sneak oil out, which obviously they are right now, they have to sell it at a lower amount to be able to do that as they're sneaking it out. And it has greater cost to be able to get it out. So even that limits the amount of income. So as people just flippantly say, well, it's not doing anything, they're still getting oil out, they're getting less revenue from that oil. And that does help not to be able to get more money into their terrorist organizations.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that piece of legislation is important and will be even more important, assuming that there's not another JCPOA. You're right. There are some people who argue that the sanctions haven't really mattered because they haven't hurt Iran either domestically or in terms of their oil revenue. Maybe they haven't hurt them absolutely, but they clearly have hurt them, which is part of why they have come back into these negotiations. And I think, assuming a failure of these negotiations in Vienna, they will need to try even harder, almost desperately, to get around the sanctions. So this initiative of yours to preserve the sanctions and extend them, I think is really important. Let me take the conversation in a slightly different direction. I know that a while ago, as part of your general interest in the Middle East, you were part of creating in the Senate a U.S. Senate bipartisan Abraham Accords caucus. I wanted to ask you to talk about that and how that relates to Iran, and particularly to policy ahead, American policy ahead toward the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Yeah, we believe it's incredibly important. And for the four of us that started the Abraham Accords Caucus, that was myself, Jackie Rosen, Joni Ernst, Cory Booker, is now expanded well beyond that. But we've kept equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats on this, because now 2 years, it's amazing to think it's been 2 years that we're into the Abraham Accords. We see the multiplication that not only has occurred already, but the potential of what this could be. The Abraham Accords were a very simple principle. It's putting economic ties back together. It's diplomatic ties. It's based on religious freedom, which is a stark statement. If anyone's read the simple Abraham Accords document, it begins with a statement about we're honoring religious liberty among our nations. And to say we're going to not only cooperate together, but we're going to work to be able to turn down the volume for anti-Semitism in nations that have taught that in their schools for a long time. It's really a revolutionary document. But right now, there are flights that are happening from Israel to the UAE. There's travel, tourism, conversation about energy, exchange of technology, medical innovations. All those things are occurring right now that weren't occurring 2 years ago. And what we want to see in this, from the group of us that wants to expand the Abraham Accords, is say, okay, we have this group of nations that are in it, these 5 nations that are in it. How can that become 7? How can that become 10? How can that become 15? Because as nations cooperate together economically, and as they work together to be able to allow religious liberty in their nations and free speech in their nations, that creates more opportunities for dialogue. It creates more opportunities for families meeting other families and engaging, especially at an economic level. When you begin to cooperate on energy and on economy, you find ways to be able to work other issues out. That provides a pathway to real stability and conversation there. It also provides an opportunity for those nations that all see the Iranian regime as the major destabilizing force in the region to be able to find avenues to be able to cooperate together, to say, what are we going to do to not only isolate the Iranian regime, but to be able to say, how does Iran shift to be able to participate economically in these nations in the future? And the way is to get out of their sanctions and to stop all their terrorist activities, and to see they really are isolated in the rest of the world. The entire region disagrees with their terrorist activities, and they show that by their engagement economically and their joint defense efforts to be able to protect themselves from Iran's missile technology.
I tell you, that's a wonderful initiative. I want to stress again how much I admire the fact that it is bipartisan. You got 4 leaders, initiators, 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, which is the way it ought to be. I also think that the Abraham Accords and your caucus point the way, or provide the beginning of an answer to the question many people who support re-entering the JCPOA ask, well, what's your alternative policy? And our alternative policy is this. I want to share 2 stories with you, because I was recently in the Middle East with a UANI delegation. The first is highly personal, and the little changes had occurred. We were flying, my wife and I, from Saudi Arabia and then to UAE on a Etihad Emirati airline, and lo and behold, when the flight attendant came around, she said to us, "Oh, Senator and Mrs. Lieberman, we have a special meal for you. We have a kosher meal." And so I said, praise the Lord, really. This is the Abraham Accords right here. The second, I want to ask you to respond to this. You can respond to the kosher meal, but you don't have to. The second is that I was speaking to one of the leaders in one of the Arab countries, and he said to me, we're puzzled by the focus that the Biden administration has again on re-entering the JCPOA. In this light, he said, for a long time, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East had a basic problem, which is that you had 2 groups of friends, and they were at odds with each other. the Arab nations and Israel. Now you've got the Arab nations and Israel collaborating, and for some reason you seem to be coming in on the side of our common enemy, which is Iran. And I tell you, I hadn't ever heard it said exactly that way, but I thought it was very powerful. And I wanted to ask you to just respond to that and the general idea of what your caucus would like to see us do next to expand the Abraham Accords and hopefully to get, although I'm skeptical, but to get Iran to behave more like a civilized, law-abiding nation.
So that's a long-term project to be able to work towards Iran actually engaging with the rest of the nations. I would be hopeful for that to be by this weekend. I don't think it's going to happen by this weekend.
Right. Understood.
This is going to be years and years and years in the process. But I do think the Iranian people are more open to it than the Iranian regime. And so I pray there is a day when we see a regime that matches the people that are there. The other challenge that we have in dealing with this is national security issues. And as you mentioned before, a group of nations with Israel and with the Arabs in the Middle East, understanding that Iran is the destabilizing force. One of the things we see cooperation on now through the Abraham Accords, one of the things that we're trying to accelerate is missile defense technology. To where multiple nations all understand that the real threat that's coming at them is coming from missiles from Iran. And what can we do together? That's Saudi Arabia, that's UAE, that's Bahrain, that's Israel, all trying to find cooperation and find interoperable systems to be able to defend themselves from an ongoing threat from Iran in the days ahead. So finding ways that nations cooperate together, both economically, for national defense, for energy policy, for water in the region and technology, healthcare, all those are aspects where there's a lot that Israel can share and a lot that other nations can engage on. The more that you actually engage in that dialogue and you find yourself tied together in some of these key things that are really important to the people of that region, the more they understand we can cooperate together on these. We're going to disagree on some areas, but we also can find some areas of agreement as well and work together as individual nations with a common threat.
I think that's very insightful. I will tell you that when the UANI delegation recently visited Saudi Arabia, in addition to the policy conversations, I was just struck by the informal conversations we had with, you might say, the younger generation of Saudis who just want to be citizens of the world. And, you know, they frankly, they want to go to Israel. They want to interact with the Israelis. They want to do business with their generation in Israel. Saudi Arabia has changed a lot internally under the Crown Prince, and I think in a very hopeful way. Senator Jim Langford, I can't thank you enough for your time. I must say, bottom line, this conversation has been encouraging to me in a way that in an area that's not always encouraging. So thank you for that. We in UANI really appreciate your leadership on these subjects. And just stay the course, and we're always here to help you in any way we can. Thank you very much for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the ongoing work. Thanks for continuing to be able to keep this nonpartisan and to be able to keep it up in the public eye. That will matter to all of us long term. So thanks for staying engaged in issues that really matter.
Hear, hear. Be well. See you soon.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.